Welcome to Module 4 on War and Peace. In this module, we will look at the ways in which war and peace are managed by the international order. In this module, we will cover classical liberalism in relation to governance versus government, that main difference between those two terms. Then we will go into the question of neoliberalism, a new theory, a newer version of classical liberalism, and discuss neoliberalism in particular through two cases. The first case will look at law of warfare, and the second case will look at the emergence of the United Nations as the pinnacle of global governance today. And we will end the module by talking about the take-home points for this module. Liberalism is a philosophical canon focusing on the difficulties of establishing just, orderly, and peaceful relations between peoples. Whereas the idea of liberalism and liberal peace dates back to the 18th or 19th century, it arrives at the field of politics through economics and philosophy. The theory argues that individuals, as rational actors, have the liberty to choose their own fate. In international relations, this was driven by scholars who were deeply interested in schemes which would promote cooperative relations among states and allow for the realization of a just and peaceful international order. Liberalism and liberal theories entered international relations most clearly through the works of Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, geographer, thinker in general. While he had many interests, Immanuel Kant was not an IR scholar, but his work on perpetual peace is often cited as an inspiration by classical liberals. The so-called Kantian peace argues that republics are better than monarchies or dictatorships. He sees the importance of republics is because he sees the importance in that particular concept, because they are less likely to seek war. Kant is, in his work, is a champion of looser federation of republics at the global level as a way towards perpetual peace. He argues that beyond democracy, liberal market economics and self-determination, international law is essential to establishing order in international relations. Classical liberals in international relations took this Kantian idea and applied it to international relations. To end war, liberals believed, states need to respect stable institutions, rule of law, and right and freedoms of individuals and states. Following World War I, post-1918, there was an audience for this kind of sentiment. The argument was the peace of 1918 would be the peace to end all war. The League of Nations experiment in the intra-war period represents an attempt by liberal thinkers and practitioners to try to establish a peaceful global order. If you are interested in this particular history, I would encourage you to look at the biography of Woodrow Wilson, the US president after World War I, and his 14 principles that came to dominate the Paris Peace Conference in 1918. Those principles represent a good example of how Kantian principles of classical liberalism came to inspire post-World War II politics. Whereas Wilson championed the level of internationalism, the domestic pressures in the United States following World War I and the emergence of the Great Depression meant that the United States never joined the League of Nations because the United States Senate never ratified the Treaty of the League of Nations, that Wilson helped create and pursued increasingly insular policies as a result of it. So in many ways, many people argue that the failure of the League of Nations was due to the American abandonment of the project and the subsequent isolationism that came to define world politics following the World War and the emergence of the global depression. Like most theories, classical liberalism is built on certain assumptions. Classical liberals, unlike realists, believe that rationality would dictate that humans would cooperate, as humans are inherently good in nature. There's a potential harmony of interest between people. Furthermore, they argue that cooperation is possible and in fact a central feature of human relations. Government is necessary and individual liberties are of supreme political importance. Some key deductions from classical liberalism are: if humans are inherently good, then states, as the collective polity, would have no interest in pursuing wars. If centralization of power is bad, pluralism and democracy must be a superior form of political organization. And if cooperation is possible, then it must be possible to achieve positive changes in international relations. Something interesting happens between the two wars. The combination of two world events, the Great Depression and the nationalism that sort of resulted in the build-up to the World War II, fully undermines the prospects of classical liberalism being the dominant approach in explaining main dynamics of international politics. If we were to look at classical liberalism, we see two pillars, sort of the political liberalism and the economic liberalism. These two pillars are undermined simultaneously by the emergence of the Great Depression, which undermines economic liberalism, and the subsequent, or the sort of the simultaneous rise of authoritarianism, fascism, and nationalism in Europe and elsewhere undermines political liberalism. So the undermining of those two political projects, in a way, undermines the classical liberalism as a project in international relations. The start of the World War II and the sort of the subsequent death and destruction really undermines and rattles the world. So beyond the poverty and isolationism caused by the Great Depression, the death, destruction, genocide, and famine caused by World War II really undermine any faith we have on the goodness of human nature. Holocaust, nuclear weapons, all embodied the worst in human nature. Whereas the prospects for classical liberalism being a dominant paradigm for understanding world politics diminished with World War II, neoliberalism emerged as a viable alternative. Now, if we were to recap classical liberalism, we would say that it's a theory that is optimistic about human nature and virtues or values nurture over nature. It has faith in education and human progress and the establishment of fair and just institutions. It also argues that humans are rational, that there's an intrinsic value of human life and moral worth of the individual that comes with inalienable human rights. The core thing to remember about classical liberalism is that it believes in the possibility of cooperation among individuals as well as states. Given that classical liberalism was built on this argument that human nature was good, obviously classical liberalism disappeared from mainstream international relations following World War II. Yet certain developments in global politics informed what was to come next, neoliberalism. These developments were economic liberalism, the emergence of the Keynesian models of economics, liberalization of the world economy through the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, and the globalization phenomenon that swept international relations in many ways, as well as the creation of successful international organizations such as the United Nations. And finally, the emergence of human rights and democracy as ethically charged concepts in global politics that are associated with the United States, which then became the victorious party to the Cold War and then became the global superpower, or the only superpower. Before we go on to discuss neoliberalism as a theory of international relations and its impact, we need to understand a key difference in two concepts that are essential to international relations. Those are the difference between governance and government. In this context, governance refers to the act of governing. The act of governing involves the application of laws and regulations, but also customs, ethical standards, and norms. Beyond the seemingly simple concept of governance, Western countries champion a set of practices they call good governance. Governance means that governance related to affairs that are managed efficiently and justly. Laws, regulations, or norms that are not necessarily themselves just good. Some of the ways in which good governance appears in world politics today is related to the questions of economics governance, development, democracy, implementation of human rights, among other areas. You may be asking yourselves, how is governance different than government? Whereas governance refers to the act of governing, government refers to the institutions and practices of government. Government can refer to the governing body of a nation, state, or community, or the system by which a nation, state, or community is governed. Obviously, we do not have an international government, but we do have international governance. International laws, norms, and standards ensure that we do have global governance. While there is no global government, given the centrality of sovereignty, rational choices of states under international law, states give up certain rights to ensure that all states cooperate to address problems that are too large for any single one of them to solve. A good example for that would be the climate change crisis. Understanding this difference between governments and governance is important to understand neoliberalism. Neoliberals argue that there is no global government, yet there is such a thing called global governance. They argue that global governance exists because we have international law, international agreements among states, and cooperation is not the exception, but rather the norm in global politics. Neoliberal thinkers argue that structural constraints such as anarchy force states to cooperate. They argue that there's a distinct possibility of mutual wins. To them, global institutions like the United Nations matter a lot because they ensure cooperation. They provide the structure for cooperation, and they reduce the cost of interaction and the cost of cooperation. Neoliberals do not deny the anarchic nature of the international system. Instead, they argue that its importance and effects have been exaggerated. They argue that neorealists underestimate the possibility of cooperation. Neoliberals believe that as pluralistic rational actors, states are likely to make decisions that provide the best outcome for their citizens, which they see to be cooperation. Neoliberals also argue that even in anarchic systems of autonomous rational states, cooperation can emerge through the building of norms, regimes, and institutions. To that, they show the example of the International Monetary Fund, Kyoto and Paris Protocols on climate change, and the Ottawa Treaty on landmines. Let us try to contextualize what we've been saying about governance and how neoliberals see the world. We can start doing so by looking at how laws of warfare ensure the neoliberal peace. What is neoliberal peace, you may ask? There are 5 points we should cover. First, it is the relations based on legal norms, moral principles, should transcend power politics. A good example for that would be peacekeeping missions and their role in international politics. That the UN sanctioned peacekeeping missions, which often are associated with to be a major part of Canadian history and Canadian foreign policy, represent sort of an inherent ethical move by a global community to sort of intervene in security conflicts inside states to provide buffer zones or to provide sort of a period to cool off between the warring parties. Secondly, institutions are central to international neoliberal peace. To that end, we can look at the history of the United Nations Security Council, the head body within the United Nations institutional structure, and its significance to world security. The UN Security Council is a body that consists of 15 member states. 5 of them are permanent states that are always there, and those countries have a veto on what resolutions get to get discussed or get to be adopted. And then there's 10 countries that rotate on a 2-year term. So they're on a 5-5 schedule. So 5 of them go for 2 years, 5 of them go for other 2 years. And then there's always 10 of them. The question of collective security is also something that states should care about, and the safety and security of other states. States must understand, as part of this liberal peace, that insecurity for one is insecurity for all. Afghanistan and Somalia are good examples of this. NATO is a good example of collective security. As we discussed in last module, under NATO, member states may be forced to go to war over defending an ally. At times, that might be against their national interest, but they believe that as part of a liberal peace project, collective security and collective defense matters. We must make a distinction between liberal peace and pacifism. Liberal scholars understand war, and liberal practitioners often rely on war to spread the seeds of perpetual peace. So we must be careful to make a distinction between liberal peace and pacifism. Let's take the examples of wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, or even Somalia. Those wars were justified in the name of democracy and human rights. That in many ways, that shows that liberal practitioners are willing to extend their war muscles in an attempt to demonstrate the value of democracy or the value of human rights. That they would go to war in the name of those concepts, to protect those concepts, or even to spread those concepts. Whether right or wrong, it's something that needs to be debated more. Finally, economic and political strands of liberalism both argue that peace is possible, in that interconnectedness among states allow them to become codependent, making war often too costly to pursue. A good example for that would be the relations between Canada and the United States. Even though we don't live in the same country, I think we have a reasonable belief that the Canada and the United States have stable relations and that they will not go to war with each other. That this is a good example for how interconnectedness among these two countries made even the idea or the suggestion of war to be too costly. Another way in which neoliberals make the case for peace and order is through international laws. And perhaps there is no better example to talk about here than the laws of war and peace. Let us take a moment to think about what law is. Law refers to the system of rules and guidelines. They're usually enforced through social institutions that govern behavior. They're informed by a constitution and or rights. There are different kinds of law, different types of law, civil law, common law. In Canada, most of our provinces are governed by common law, except for a few of our provinces, in particular Quebec, that is governed by civil law. Different aspects of law have different focus. There's contract law, there's criminal law, there's property law, and then there's also different scales of law that range from municipal laws to international laws. Domestic laws are different than international laws, in that international laws are not as binding as domestic laws. While citizens cannot say that they do not recognize the law in the court while facing a crime, states can often back down from their commitments to international law. Having said that, doing so is very costly, and states do not tend to do that. International laws are the set of rules generally regarded and accepted as binding in relation between states and nations. They serve as the framework for practice of stable and organized international relations. There are three kinds of international law: public international law, private international law, and supranational international law. For the purposes of our lecture, we're going to be particularly looking at the public international law. But to give you a sense of what the other two are, private international law looks at dealings among companies and corporations and international individuals that transcend individual boundaries of sovereign states. So if I were to do business with someone in the United States, we would have to decide where a sort of an arbitration would have to take place. If we had a disagreement among our partners, we would have to decide whether the court case will be settled in the United States or in Canada. And that would be part of the private international law. Supranational law is the European Union's own body of law, that it looks at how different EU member states interact with each other. In relation to the laws of war and peace, we can identify three categories. First, during war, warring parties are limited to clearly defined rules of engagement, in that soldiers are not allowed to shoot and kill indiscriminately. These rules of engagement are defined by broader laws of warfare. There are limits of acceptable conduct in war. First, we must declare war, that everyone knows that we're at war. There needs to be a acceptance of surrender. If someone shows a white flag, if someone says, I surrender, then the other party must understand that the other party has surrendered and treat them with the respect and dignity. Which takes us to the next question, the prisoner of war, that how we treat prisoners of war is defined by Geneva Convention. And finally, there's a distinction between military necessity, distinction, and proportionality in responses to attacks. These laws are, however, based on a distinction between wartime and peacetime. And we might be seeing now is that this distinction might be disappearing, that it is not clear when there is war and when there is peace. Increasing number of terror attacks and increasing number of proliferation of non-state actors getting involved in conflict shows that there is a sort of there's a particular sort of blurriness that is emerging between those clear distinctions which sustain the laws of warfare. Rules of engagement are particularly interesting pieces of document. They are usually given to soldiers on the ground, and they tell the soldiers what they can or cannot do and how they can or cannot engage in fighting. So the document that you see on your screen were the rules of engagement for American forces in the Somalia in the 1990s, where the conflict was an interesting one. I mean, the iconic cultural memory of that is with the movie Black Hawk Down, which you can watch. But the particular sort of United States mission was to bring stability and democracy into a civil war-torn country. So it's not, this document was the guiding principle for the U.S. forces and how they can or cannot sort of engage with hostile parties. The first thing to look at, the interesting thing in the document, is the final part that says, remember, the United States is not at war. Treat all persons with dignity and respect, and use minimum force to carry out mission. Always be prepared to act in self-defense. That's an interesting way of giving orders to someone. 2 slides ago, we talked about how the distinction between wartime and peacetime may be disappearing. That particular development has obvious, clear implications for a group of people in particular: prisoners of war. Geneva Conventions, a significant part of international law and warfare, comprise of four treaties and three additional products or protocols that establish the standards of international law for the humanitarian treatment of war and war personnel. Historically, popular culture has provided some interesting insights into what life as a prisoner of war was like. An amazing movie that I would recommend all of you to watch is The Great Escape, that looked at Allied prisoners of war under Nazi captivity and their constant attempts to escape that captivity. Empire of the Sun, similarly, a great cultural product, looked at the Allied prisoners of war under Japanese captivity, whereas both of these movies followed what life was like for POWs during World War II. Those were times when the soldiers were protected by the Geneva Conventions. Since 2011 or 2001 and the start of the global war on terror following September 11 attacks, we see sort of a change, a shift in this. As we see with the movie Zero Dark 30, under the global war on terror, the definition of prisoners of war and the war peace distinction blurred and changed. The United States government introduced some reinterpretations of international law, arguing that people that were not fighting for states were not protected under Geneva Convention. As such, they would be they could be subjected to different forms of interrogation techniques and different forms of detention that would not necessarily be agreeable to Geneva Conventions. If we look at post 9/11 policies under the global war on terror in particular, in Afghanistan and Iraq, we see that the nature of warfare and the laws of warfare has changed. US military, along with the CIA Black Ops, has changed the way they fight and detain prisoners. US captured Taliban and Al Qaeda fighters and subjected them to quote unquote enhanced interrogation techniques or torture in black sites away from conventional military prisons. Under the 2001 presidential order, US created the unlawful combatants and illegal enemy combatants category in order to create a category for prisoner of war that were deemed non-state fighters and thus not subjected to the Geneva Conventions. In other words, by creating this unlawful combatant or the illegal enemy combatant category, the United States created a new legal category that prevented individuals from being subjected to the protections that were granted to soldiers under the Geneva Conventions. Now, if we were to look at what we were supposed to get out of this brief case on laws of warfare, under international law, historically we have established wars that have limits, that militaries cannot do everything and anything during warfare. Their actions are limited by the rules of engagement, which are drafted in relation to the existing laws of warfare and questions of proportionality. There are conditions of surrender, established practices for how to keep prisoners of war, and Geneva Conventions have established global norms and laws for the treatment of those affected by warfare. Under the global war on terror, the definition of war and peace is shifting. This has effects on how states conduct warfare. In particular, the impact of this change is visible under the U.S. detention and interrogation practices for unlawful enemy combatants. Whereas our discussion of international law of warfare focused on the role of international law in providing order and governance to warfare among nations, the case of neoliberalism and the United Nations will help us understand how international organizations help states maintain an international order based around the structures of global governance. This is a picture from the signing ceremony of the United Nations Treaty that was signed following the end of the Second World War. While the United Nations Treaty was signed in San Francisco in June 1945 following the end of the World War II, its foundations were laid during the World War II by Allied countries, especially during talks at Dumbarton Oaks, where negotiations over the UN Charter took place prior to the end of the World War II. The UN Treaty established key institutions of the organization, whereas the UN Charter on Human Rights was signed in 1948. The United Nations today consists of five bodies: the General Assembly, the Security Council, Economic and Social Council, the International Court of Justice, and the Secretariat. In its simplest form, this is what the United Nations looks like. In reality, however, the United Nations is an institutional maze. It consists of numerous agencies, bodies, programs, affiliated NGOs, and private actors. All of them, when they combine together, form the United Nations system and the United Nations system of organizations. The core body of the United Nations is the General Assembly. It has limited number of seats, and in particular during the Cold War, it had even more limited number of seats during the Cold War. United Nations Security Council veto limited the number of seats in both the Soviet Union and the Allied countries, limited countries that each other recognized. The colonization and increased number of UN General Assembly members corresponded with the end of the Cold War. Now, the General Assembly have mostly symbolic powers, but it is a forum for debate, but not for real action. Security Council is the core body of the United Nations. It is the body with most power within the UN. It has binding powers, and as a central body within the UN family, it serves an important purpose. Initially, it had 11 members. Today, it has 15 members. 5 of those members are permanent members, and 10 of them are 2-year members. The resolutions that come out of the Security Council are binding resolutions. They vote on the new UN members, and they vote on the UN Secretary General. UN Security Council is a body where states act in line with their national interest. National interest and primacy of national sovereignty often undermine UN Security Council's mandate. They have failed to create a UN military staff committee, and they have failed to establish UN bases around the world and a UN military branch as imagined by the original UN treaty. But they have also in many ways, provided peace and security to the world and maintained the world from going into prevented the world from going into World War III. Question of sovereignty and national interest plagues the UN Security Council. A core question posed by the critics of the Council is whose security is the organization interested in? Whereas the UN Security Council was meant to create a forum or a collective body for addressing the world's security problems, veto powers given to the permanent 5 member states undermined this. It obviously succeeded in preventing World War III, yet it had very little effect. In fact, it had an amplifying effect on the number of small wars in Korea and Suez and India, Pakistan, and in general Middle East and North Africa, as well as the continent of Africa. It is important to understand that the history of the UN Security Council was shaped by the Cold War. But it is also important to understand that the Cold War was shaped by the UN Security Council. Since the end of the Cold War, the UN Security Council saw a period of regeneration and reactivity in the 1990s. New momentum for UN Security Council activism was visible in that era. There was a decline in the veto use. The unipolar world seemed to suggest that the traditional veto wars between the United States and the Soviet Union disappeared, and the United States was able to move its agenda forward. This was very visible in the first Gulf War and the UN Security Council resolution on the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, as well as the UN missions in Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia. Yet this post-Cold War activism did not translate to going back to the original intentions. It just meant that the United States was able to push its agenda through. Final body of the United Nations that we will cover today is the Secretariat, the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Secretary General is the chief diplomat of the United Nations. It is the de facto spokesperson and the leader of the UN. Secretary General is elected by the UN Security Council and resides in New York City. Currently, the Secretary General is Antonio Guterres, who used to be the Commissioner for UN Agency on Human Rights. It's important to understand what UN does and how UN fits within the general puzzle of the global politics. UN serves as a pillar of global governance. There are various agencies within the United Nations system of organizations that oversee numerous areas of international collaboration. The UN is highly involved in the quest for refugees, climate change, food aid, and development. It principally serves as a forum for states to cooperate. It reduces the cost of collaboration because it has its own bureaucracy and it has its own sort of institutions. It helps states collaborate better. It represents what institutional cooperation looks like at the international level. It is also important to understand that the United Nations is not a global government. It has its limitations, that it is still bound by the question of state sovereignty. Let's take a moment to reflect on what we learned during Module 4. Classical liberalism looked at the altruistic nature of human beings to make the case for why humans cooperate. They argued that human beings were good, human beings were inclined to cooperate. Obviously, what happened during World War II and the sort of previous global depression undermined the case for human nature being good or altruistic. The rise of nationalism, fascism, and the Holocaust, as well as the use of nuclear weapons and the millions of people who died during the war, made it very difficult to talk about a good human nature. The neo variant of liberalism, neoliberalism, focused on structural effects of anarchy to make the case for why states are more likely to cooperate when facing uncertainty. So they take the same puzzle as neorealists, the question of structural effects of anarchy, and argue that rather than anarchy forcing states to be competitive or conflictual, they argue that neoliberalism forces states to be more cooperative. So, focusing on things like international law and international organizations and norms and practices of global governance, neoliberals argue that states are likely to cooperate due to their interdependence on each other. We looked at laws of warfare and the UN as cases to show that the strengths of neoliberal argument. Yet, as we saw last week, neorealist argument, or the last module, neorealist argument on self interest and uncertainties likelihood of causing conflict is also too important to underestimate. This is all to say, no single theory is likely to explain every aspect of international politics. So, as informed observers, we need to understand the strengths and weaknesses of each theory. Question for Module 4 is, why do we have international law, norms, and principles under anarchy? How does liberalism explain their purpose? Answer this question by using one of the cases we have covered in this module. Thank you.